Hey guys, welcome back to Custom Builds. This is Kiran from Custom Builds. Today we are going to talk about motherboards. Today I'm going to explain what are the kinds of motherboard and what are the sizes of motherboard, what are the brands of motherboards, and which processors are compatible with which motherboards. Basically, there are two kinds of motherboard. One motherboard will be supporting Intel, another motherboard will be supporting AMD. So, for example, this particular MSI motherboard, it is a motherboard which supports Intel processor, and this particular ASRock motherboard, it is designed to support AMD Ryzen processors. We can't put a Ryzen CPU in an Intel motherboard and an Intel CPU in a Ryzen motherboard. And in particular Intel and AMD motherboard, there are many types. For example, if you're into buying an Intel CPU, there are different generations of the processors. For example, from 6th generation to 10th generation, the motherboard varies. For 6th generation Intel processor, you need a H110 motherboard with LGA 1151 socket. And there are many sockets like that. From first generation of the processor to the 12th generation of the processor, there are many motherboards. I'll show you some examples here. This motherboard supports Intel 10th generation CPUs. This is H14 motherboard. The socket is LGA 1200, and this motherboard is only designed to support Intel CPUs with LGA 1200 socket, which is nothing but Intel 10th generation processor. This particular motherboard is ASRock A320 motherboard. This motherboard is designed for AMD, and the socket of this motherboard is M4. Each successive generation of CPU releases different motherboard depending on the type of CPU and the socket. So apart from that, there are many other brands, board partners. They manufacture motherboards for the CPU. For example, this motherboard was manufactured by ASRock for AMD platform. This motherboard was manufactured by MSI for Intel platform, and this is a Gigabyte motherboard, specifically a Aorus motherboard. These are the companies who manufacture motherboards, and all motherboards are same apart from designs and certain features. When it comes to the company of the motherboard, this ASRock motherboard is also a motherboard which supports AMD processor with A320 chipset. This is also a motherboard which is from MSI, has the same chipset and supports the same processor, but the brand is MSI. Like this, each brand will have their own name for the motherboard, and they have the chipset name in common, and features depend on the motherboard model which you are gonna buy. There are many other motherboard manufacturers like ASUS, MSI, Gigabyte, BioStar, and even Colorful, even Galax, and they manufacture both Intel and AMD motherboards. The size of the motherboard, like the form factor, there are basically three form factors of the motherboard. One is ITX, which is the most smallest motherboard. Another is M80X, micro ATX motherboard. This is little bit bigger than this, and apart from that, you will find a full ATX motherboard, which will be like this. This is a full ATX motherboard. If we see the difference between a full ATX motherboard and a M80X motherboard, is ATX motherboards are the biggest when it comes to all the other motherboards which I told. The advantage of this motherboard will be you can put up to 3 graphics cards depending on your slots. This particular motherboard has 2 PCI slots for graphics card, and you can put 4 RAM sticks, and this motherboard supports DDR4 RAM, so it can support up to 128 GB of RAM, and this particular socket is AMD, and this motherboard is also AMD motherboard. You can see the socket, they are the same, and this motherboard, it's smaller when compared to this motherboard, and this motherboard is a micro ATX motherboard. So for super small builds, there is another form factor of the motherboard which is called ITX motherboard. So this is an ITX motherboard. If we compare the size, so this motherboard is an ATX motherboard. This is a smaller version of the ATX motherboard, which is M80X, which is micro ATX motherboard, and this is an ITX motherboard. This motherboard can be used to build very compact and small computers. The disadvantage of this motherboard is you can't put more than 2 RAM sticks, and it can support up to 64 GB of RAM. All these motherboards are the same when it comes to socket. This motherboard is also AM4 socket, this is also AM4, this is also AM4. The meaning of this is this particular motherboard, these 3 motherboards can only support one CPU which is AMD's Ryzen CPU. These are the bifurcation when it comes to form factor. Apart from that, there are many other things to be noted. If you consider an AMD processor, which is Ryzen, in one motherboard, not always the form factor is not only the thing that judges the motherboard price and quality. So there is something called a chipset which interfaces your CPU with the other components of the motherboard. Even though a motherboard is on the same platform when it comes to AMD or Intel, depending on the features that you're getting in the motherboard and the chipset what you're gonna get in the motherboard bifurcation are done. So this is a basic motherboard from AMD, specifically MSI's A320 Pro Max motherboard. This motherboard is very basic, and you can see it has 2 RAM slots and all the stuff. And this is a little bit higher end motherboard, which is MSI's B450 Pro Max motherboard. We can clearly see what is the difference between this and this motherboard. This is also an MITx motherboard, but this motherboard is somewhat larger when compared to this motherboard. And this motherboard has 4 RAM slots. This motherboard has 2 RAM slots. Due to this motherboard having B450 chipset, which is higher end than compared to the A320 chipset, which is in this motherboard, this motherboard's quality is somewhat better. And when it comes to power delivery and other concepts, this motherboard is better than what you are getting in the basic A320 motherboard. And I told you earlier, this motherboard has 4 amp slots. In that also you'll get higher end motherboard. When it comes to this motherboard, this is an Aorus B450 motherboard, which is the same chipset, but this motherboard is a gaming branded motherboard, and you can see what you can see. You can see it has like 2 slots for NVMe SSD, 2 slots for graphics card, and a good power delivery, which is somewhat better than what you saw in the MSI B450 basic motherboard. And above this, you can also find X570 and X470, X370. These are the motherboards which is above that. But when it comes to Intel, you can also find the same thing happening. So, for example, this is an MSI H410 Pro VH motherboard. This motherboard you can find, this is an Intel motherboard. It will cost like 6,000 rupees. You can see this motherboard has 2 RAM slots, 1 PCI X16 slot, CPU socket. Every motherboard should have that. Apart from that, nothing else much. But if you see a little bit higher end motherboard, when this is a Mortar motherboard. This is a B360 Mortar motherboard, higher end motherboard than that, but this motherboard belongs to 9th generation family of motherboard. This motherboard is higher end than that motherboard, and you can see it has 4 RAM slots, and this is an Intel motherboard. The flagship motherboard which can do everything when it comes to Intel is Z series motherboard. The Z series motherboard have capability of overclocking, and they are pretty good when it comes to quality as well. So this is MSI's Z490A Pro. You can see the motherboard is built really well when it comes to the build quality, and this motherboard also has 2 RAM slots, 4 RAM slots with 2 slots for installing NVMe SSD, and it has many 1x slot. You can convert this thing to your Wi-Fi or Bluetooth you can add, and I/O is also good. You have like USB 3.0 and stuff, and you can also find features like front panel USB-C and all other stuff that you can find in a good quality motherboard. These are the premium class motherboard. Above this also you can find motherboard. In Z490 you can find Z490 Godlike, Ace, Tomahawk, and those kind of motherboard. Those are real expensive high-end motherboards. These are the bifurcation when it comes to motherboard. So basically what we should do is, when it comes to determining which motherboard we have to buy, we have to consider the budget. If you have a particular budget, if you don't want to spend more than 30,000 rupees on your PC, you can't put a X570 motherboard in that, because the motherboard itself costs like 25,000. So what you can do, you can buy a basic A320 motherboard, or if your budget extends, you can buy a B450 motherboard if you're into buying AMD, or B series Intel motherboards also pretty good. We can buy a B460, B360, those kind of motherboard when it comes to buying motherboard. Basically, we have to consider the budget which you are going to work. And if you are into buying anything like Core i5 or Ryzen 5, you don't need a B450 motherboard. You can also run your processor comfortably in an A320 basic motherboard or a H410 basic motherboard, because those processors will not pull more than 70 watts. Your motherboard VRM will be able to handle it around, unless and until you will be putting more than 64 GB of RAM, then you have to buy a B450 motherboard. There are many advantages which comes with buying a better quality motherboard. If you have any other doubts regarding this particular video, you can drop a comment below. We'll surely help you out. Or you can also message us on 97399 42917. We are available in Signal, WhatsApp as well as Instagram as well. You can find the Instagram ID in the link in the description below. And if you want to build a PC, you can contact us. We are basically from Bangalore. You can find us. You'll get our Google ID. If you type custom builds in Google search, you'll find our ID. You can click the link in the description below. It will directly go to our Google page. And do visit www.custombuilds.online. Thanks for watching the video. Signing out. This is Kiran. Bye. Subscribe.